live, same as every morning, or at least morning for me. All right. How is it going? Good to see you. Guys piling in quickly, huh? All right. Let me get the hydration started. All right. Today, we have talked about our end of year special quite a bit. And we've talked about it from the position of our relocatees. However, our clients in that area are kind of split right down the middle, right? So some folks, while they are relocatees, there's a ton of folks that are just generational wealth folks, and they're not relocatees at all, right? So we're going to talk today a bit about how our generational wealth folks go ahead and utilize the bond laddering strategy for their offshore trusts, which keeps the offshore trusts in the non-grantor status, right? So typically what happens is when a client decides to do an offshore trust with us, they have to decide whether or not that offshore trust is going to be a non-grantor trust or a grantor trust. There are some IRS tests that they have to get through in order to make that happen. So we always recommend that they speak to their local person. We typically recommend that that person be a JD and a CPA, right? So a tax attorney, not just a CPA. And the people that we work with are JD CPAs and EAs, right? So we tend to make those recommendations because tax people, just like all other specialists, have niches, right? So you don't want to go to a foot doctor if your head hurts, right? So even if somebody is a CPA, they may not have the knowledge that you need for international taxes. So it's really important that your local person actually has a grasp of international, as well as the local place where you come from, because there could be state taxes that you got to worry about and all that stuff, right? So all of those positions, EAs, JDs, of course, are lawyers, EAs and CPAs, they all kind of have their own education set. However, just EAs sometimes are not very effective on the state level, right? EAs focus on federal tax and sometimes really can't help you out with what might happen with your local tax, right? So what you want to do is you want to understand the difference between grantor and non-grantor. Okay, from our point of view, if you have a grantor trust, it means that you're going to have to be doing a lot of extra filings with the IRS if you're a U.S. citizen, right? It also means that you're going to have a certain level of control typically over the trust that would allow creditors, judgmentors, so on and so forth, to be able to penetrate the trust through you. Okay. Now there are ways to kind of circumvent that, but the door is open. Okay. If there's a non-grantor trust, it means that you've closed off all access to the trust for you. All right. Not for the beneficiaries. And that no U.S. assets are funding the trust, right? So the non-grantor trust is almost like saying, hey, this trust is out of your jurisdiction to the IRS, okay? So you go to irs.gov, go to a little search bar in the irs.gov, type in their non-grantor trust, okay, and see what it says. Okay, typically offshore trusts are assumed to be grantor. So you have to overcome the assumption of a grantor trust were it to be questioned. So we make sure that you have, all the documentation that you might need for that. And we do that with your local person. So whoever's doing your tax strategy, we do that with them. Now, sometimes they'll say, no, it's actually better for you to have the grantor Which if they say that, it's definitely true because it's a lot more work for them. So for them to say that, they're adding a bunch of more paperwork to their plate and compliance work to their plate. But if they say that, it's typically true, right? And there's typically a pretty solid breakdown that you would understand as to why that might be true. Okay. However, with generational wealth trust, typically it makes sense for them to be non-grantor. Why? Because they don't benefit you. I've said that 100,000 times. You're going to hear it 100,000 more. Your personal wealth plan has to be separate from your generational wealth plan if you want the generational wealth plan to have any teeth. Okay? So your generational wealth plan does not benefit you. And because it does not benefit you, by its nature, it's non-grantor. Okay? So there's something that you'll hear a lot, form over function. Right? If um, if you set something up that should be non-grantor, you're calling it non-grantor, but it functions as a grantor trust, the IRS is allowed to just disregard whatever you're calling it, whatever little fancy legal the structure you put around it. They can just disregard all of that because it doesn't function the way it should function in order for it to be exempt from their jurisdiction or whatever it is you're trying to achieve, whether it's it's exempt from their tax jurisdiction or exempt from filing requirements or whatever the case it is that you're trying to avoid. So it has to be legitimate, right? Which there's nothing more legitimate than a generational wealth trust, right? Where only your kids or even your grandkids are the only beneficiaries and you don't benefit from it, right? But how do you keep the U.S. assets out? That's where a lot of people screw up, right? They they can't keep the U.S. assets out of the offshore trust. So how do you do that? There's where the bond laddering comes in, right? So what some of the generational trust clients will do is they'll go ahead, set up the generational wealth trust, and then they'll turn around and have the trust do the bond ladder. Now, because that bond ladder isn't covering their, their basic income, like our relocation bond laddering clients, where their bond laddering is paying them enough so that they don't have to work anymore, or so that their basic needs are met after they relocate. This bond laddering is actually pumping money into the trust so that you can start compounding what's in the trust so that 20 years later there's over $1 million in there or whatever the case might be, right? And so for them, they don't necessarily have to have the same limits. They don't have to have the same minimums that the person who is buying that bond ladder in order to live off of those dividends needs to do, because you're not living off of it. All you're doing is you're getting some sort of ROI on it, and then you're taking that ROI and reinvesting it right away, right? So there's not even any distributions coming out of the trust at that point. When the distributions do start flowing out of the trust, they're going to go to the trustee, 10, 20, 30, even 60. There's even certain trusts that we got running where there's no distribution for the first 60 years. The more time, the more money. It's just the way it works. More time, the more money. Okay? Because what you're going to be doing is compounding over all of that time. So all the money that comes out of that trust on ROI will get compounded by being reinvested into whatever the best investment vehicle in that moment happens to be, right? So that's how that works. So by doing the bond ladder, it'll supercharge the trust, because now if you do the bond ladder, the government is still paying in a payment per month into that trust. Every month, the government's dumping money into that trust, right? And then the trustee is now taking that money and cutting it up in whatever way you decided in the trustee. Because the trustee does not have discretion, okay? The trustee can only invest the way that you told them to invest, right? So, for example, the trustee might say something like, okay, we practice capital preservation, which means that the principal amount that is in the trust when it gets started, we try to preserve that amount, okay? And then beyond that, we practice, 100% drip, right? Dividend reinvestment plan. Okay. Might be 80% drip, whatever floats your boat, right? And so then you would say, okay, out of the drip, out of the dividends that are being reinvested into the generational wealth, here's the breakdown, right? So you might say, okay, 30% gets invested in real estate investment trusts, right? On the stock market, REITs, they're called, right? 30% goes in the REITs. Okay, fine. Another 20% goes in the bond. That's 50% of it right there. Okay, fine. Another 20% goes into stocks, right? Maybe you're fancy with your investing. You have investment knowledge, so you say, okay, I want 5% in derivatives, very advanced investing derivatives. I want another 5% in options, right? These are both very risky. That's why the percentage is so much smaller, right? So it's all based on your risk, tolerance. And then you could say, all right, now I want 30% available for private business investment, right? So actual investments into the businesses in the community. And that might lead to, once you start making distributions, that amount is available for investment into your kids' business ventures, right? And then you can hold back a piece of it and say, okay, this is for education, right? So we're holding back, the last whatever, you know, 30% for education or whatever, right? And then that's what the trustee will do. They'll do exactly what you've told them to do, right? Now, there should be some leeway in case something disappears, right? Like, for example, if you say, I want 10% invested in crypto, is there a chance that crypto as an investment might disappear, or that crypto as an investment for individuals might disappear? There's a chance of that, right? So you want to make sure that the trust deed isn't set up in such a way where if something becomes illegal or something changes its form and becomes something else, that the trustee has to keep trying to do the thing that doesn't exist anymore because that's what the trust deed says. You want to make it so that if something changes in the law or something changes in the framework of how we do things, then the trust can adapt as well, right? There are like old school trusts that they don't really work the same way that we do, but you can go back and take a look at them, and they talk about, in the United States anyway, they talk about silver certificate reimbursement in the trust. So the trustee is sitting there trying to take US dollars and trade them in for silver, which you couldn't do after the silver certificates went away and we got onto the Federal Reserve Bank system, right? But there was no one imagined that change happening. It was like, we're always going to have silver certificates, right? So there was a point in time in American history where you had a piece of paper that said you can turn this into the U.S. government for its value of silver. It's called a silver certificate, and so you can go back and see these kind of old trusts that were written up, and they made sense when they were written, and now it's impossible to do what the trust deed said. And if the trust lasts forever, and the trustee has to do whatever the trust deed says, then now what? Right? Now, when it's impossible to get silver certificates, how do you comply with the trust? And typically what would happen is the trust would die. If you couldn't comply with the trust, it would just die, right? So you want to make sure that there's some kind of mechanism in there to allow for the trustee company to adjust things within the spirit of the original trust deed, but to comply with law as well, right? Jumbo Newton. All right, so that mechanism is typically built into the trust deed, and then there's a position within the trust called the enforcer. The enforcer makes sure that the trustee doesn't make a change outside of the spirit of the essentially the grantor, right? The originator of the trust, right? So if the laws change, all right, that's fine. We can make the adjustments to the trust deed to meet the new legal requirements, but the enforcer would make sure that the trustee doesn't go overboard and change the trust to what they want it to be, under the guise of meeting the new legal requirements, right? Okay, great. So we have the structure of how that works and the nitty gritty of, of how you would make those changes if need be, since it's an irrevocable trust. So all that has to be thought through in advance, which means that you have to be using a professional to do it. Okay, so now all of that is thought through. You got the trust up and running. It now owns the bonds. The bonds are paying in every single month. So the compounding effect is supercharged, right? So we'll have folks that will come in and they'll create a trust. They'll put one payment in the trust and compound that one payment, right? We got a lot of folks that do that. We had a young couple just do that a few months back, where they came in, they threw like less than $4,000, but more than 3,500. I can't remember the exact number, but they did that on the basis of, we had did some math on some guaranteed return of investment, and the length of the bond. And so by buying that bond, and it was like a 25-year bond, by doing that, just the money that was going to be paid off of that one bond, and then that being, compounded over time, they were looking at, by the end of the 25-year bond, the $3,000 being somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000, right? And so you can do that. You can do the math, figure out what you're going to get at the end of the maturity, and you can, just put in that one payment and then let it rock out. All right. There's always risk, so there's might be a risk that something happens with the market. You don't get where you want to go as fast as you thought. But the opposite is also true. There's also a risk that you get there in half the time, right? Due to the same, market factors. So that's the way that works, right? But obviously, if you keep adding money to the pot that's compounding, it compounds faster, right? So that's why, for those generational wealth clients, the bond ladder actually supercharges their generational wealth trust, and it compounds at like 4 times the rate, because you're getting 12 additional payments per year. Right? So you're getting 12 additional payments per year, pushing that compounding up further and further and further, 12 times a year. Okay. So that's why the laddering, supercharges. Now, can you just get one bond like those folks did? Sure, you could. Can you just make, one additional investment? Sure, you could. Could you also not get any bonds and make payments like from your paycheck or something like that? Yes, you could. However, if you did that and you're an American, you would more than likely create a situation where, instead of that being a non-grantor, you would have probably just made that a grantor trust by doing that. So there's that. All right, any questions on that? Why would that have made it grant? Because you're using U.S. assets. So as you keep taking your U.S. assets and dumping them into the offshore trust, the IRS will make the argument that because you keep funding it with U.S. assets, it's a non-grantor trust. Or it's a grantor trust. I'm sorry. It's a grantor trust, right? So if you're using the bond ladder, then you're funding it with Kenyan assets, right? You're funding it with those bond payments that are owned by the trust. Because remember, you're not the one who owns the central bank account that bought the bonds. The trust does. So if you're using the bond ladder, then all of the money going into the trust is originating in Kenya legitimately. Remember, it's not about trying to find some weird, trick or, twist words or anything like that. That won't work. That won't pass the form over function test, right? It has to pass a form over function test, or it'll just be disregarded. So no matter how clever you are, no matter what kind of weird loopholes you think you can figure out, the whole purpose of the form over function test is to eliminate the smartest plan and the smartest strategy by simply seeing that, oh, it you're just creating all of this stuff to bypass, your requirements. I want to be employed abroad. How do I go about it? I have no idea. Unfortunately, this is not an abroad employment show. I have no clue. I can help you with generational wealth. Awesome, Austin. Happy to see that it's clicking for you. All right. Any other questions on that? How much extra paperwork is there for a grantor trust? Um, a lot. I'm trying to think of the exact forms, and they're not coming to mind right now, so I don't want to blurt out the wrong number. But there are about four additional IRS forms. There's FinCEN reporting that you'll have to do. There's FBAR reporting that you'll have to do. And in an FBAR, you have to like report your bank accounts, the bank account balances, and then the income of the trust becomes taxable, right? So as the trust is making money over time, there might be a tax event as the trust is gaining income over time. So for some people, does that not matter? Yeah, for some people that doesn't matter. It depends on what they have going on in their life, right? And those people will normally structure things differently. But there are situations where it makes sense to do all of that reporting and all of that filing, because of whatever other deductions you have going on. It makes more sense to just bring all of that into the pot and then wipe it out if you're capable of wiping it out, versus leaving something outside of the pot, right? So think of it think of it kind of like bankruptcy. For some folks, it's going to make sense for them to bring every little debt they got into the bankruptcy and wipe everything out, because of their family circumstances, right? But if you do that, depending on like the chapter of bankruptcy you file, you'll lose your car, you'll lose your house, right? So for other folks, it's like, all right, well, I want to keep my car and I want to keep my house, so I'm going to file a different chapter of bankruptcy where everything doesn't come into the pot and the payments just get restructured on my mortgage and the payments get restructured on my car note, but everything else gets wiped out, right? So two people doing the same thing, both filing for bankruptcy, but because of their personal situations, they're doing it in completely different ways, and certain debts are not getting wiped out for very specific reasons versus everything that can be discharged being discharged, right? So it's the same type of thing. There's some folks that like it makes all the sense in the world to be non-grantor, right, and not have to do all the paperwork and all of that, versus being grantor and having to do all the paperwork and all the reporting. How much paperwork is there for the bonds? None. Yeah, the bonds are completely an electronic process. There is some paperwork to get to that point, right? And typically that is the formation of the trust, though. It's not directly the bonds. So the bonds are just they'll just be purchased by the trust. So yeah, there's not a whole lot of paperwork done for that. The trustee will essentially handle all of that once the trust is established. Um, okay. Can you be the trustee? Yes, you can. That would create a grantor trust. So if you're trustee, it's automatically grantor, right? Because one of the tests to figure out whether it's grantor or not is a control test. How much control over the trust do you have, right? Essentially, the answer should be none if you do it properly, right? You would still be in charge of everything that the trust is doing, but you do that in advance through the trust deed. It's called the trust deed controls everything the trustee is allowed to do. The trustee cannot do anything outside of the trust deed, which is why when people create trusts with Chat GPT or just on their own and they wing it, the trust always fails, right? And it doesn't always fail in the sense that like it doesn't do what you want it to do. That's typically not how it fails. Typically, it does exactly what you want it to do. The problem because you don't have the experience to think of all of the things that can happen and are likely to happen, and one of those things happen and wipes out the trust. So, what does that mean, right? The example that I like to give because it was so horrendous when these clients showed up is we had some clients that onboarded from the US and already had a trust. That's actually quite common with us, with our clients. They already have a trust when they get to us and now they need an offshore trust, right? And so they already had a trust, and the trust setup was that the trust owned a bunch of LLCs or a series LLC, one or the other, and they had a bunch of apartment Airbnb short-term rental apartment buildings, in and each one of these Airbnbs kicked up to the trust. The trust managed it, and the money was set to the side for their kids' college fund. Okay, great idea, fine. They did the trust themselves though, and they weren't experts and they didn't have the experience to know what to put in the trust. So while the trust did all the great things that they wanted it to do, what they weren't thinking about were the bad things. So they left no mechanism in the trust to evict. They didn't create an article in the trust deed or in the operating agreements of the companies underneath the trust deed that said when someone doesn't pay you, this is how you evict them, right? You give this notice, and when they don't do this notice, you file in this. There was none of that, right? So the trustee can only do what's in the trust deed, and they did an irrevocable trust themselves. Worst thing you can ever think of doing. So somebody didn't pay for whatever reason, and the trustee realized they couldn't evict them, and they ended up telling all the other tenants like, hey, did you know we can't be evicted, like we don't have to pay? So everyone stopped paying. They had to go to a judge to invalidate the trust. That took about 2 years. So everyone is living in their places not paying rent for 2 years, right? And all of this was supposed to be their kids' college fund, right? Then they finally get the judge to invalidate the trust. All of those things snap back into their ownership. It was all owned by the trust, right? It all snaps back into their personal ownership. So from the IRS's perspective, you just made $2-3 million because all these properties just shot back in the unit. So you owe taxes on that, right? So now you got to go to war with the IRS and go fight them and get your EA involved and all of that stuff to let them know like no, like we did not make a profit, so on and so forth. And now you can finally start eviction proceedings. You can't just kick them out, right? It's been 2 years, they ain't paid you nothing. Now you can start eviction proceedings, right? So it ended up being like a 3-year ordeal, all because they thought that writing a trust themselves instead of paying a professional to do it might save them a couple bucks. Well, it cost them a couple $100,000. So when it comes to irrevocable trusts, you need a professional, right? If you do a revocable living trust or something like that, where you can just snap your fingers and get rid of it, fine, right? There's no asset protection in that, by the way, but fine, okay? Because you can just revoke it when you make your mistakes. And if you feel like you want to learn trust the hard way, go for it. But when you do an irrevocable trust, you're going to have a problem, all right? It's going to be very, very difficult for you to fix mistakes after the fact. So that's the issue with the trust deeds if they're not, written properly. And that's how you have control over the trust, even though you can't touch it, because you're the one who wrote the trust deed. The trustee can't do anything that's not included in that trust deed. The number one mistake that people make is they try to lump all their trust activities together under one trust. We see it here all the time. Well, couldn't you just mix that in the same trust? The more things you mix into one trust, the closer you get to the catastrophic trust failure, right? Each trust should have one or two specific things that it does, and that's all it does. And then if you need something else done, you create a new trust for that, right? So your generational wealth trust shouldn't be doubling as your asset protection trust and the blah, 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 blah. No, right? Can it protect assets? Yes. It'll protect its assets, not your whole, family's assets. It'll protect the assets that it makes. If you have enough assets, typically, 1 million plus in assets that need to be protected, then you create a asset protection trust in a completely different jurisdiction, the best jurisdiction for the protection of those particular types of assets. All right. There are no catch-all jurisdictions, right? So the people who are like, Nevis, the best jurisdiction for asset protection, that's bullshit, right? Cook Islands, best jurisdiction for that's bullshit. It depends on what the assets are, right? If they're, intellectual property, there are certain jurisdictions that are better at protecting intellectual property than others. If it's physical, real estate, real property, there are certain jurisdictions that are better at protecting real estate than others, right? So you just got to get with your professional, break down your specific situation, and go from there. The issue is that, people like these kind of platforms and these like social media things, and they like to sit down on social media and get these exact answers, that they can then ignore and not even implement anyway. Right? But the truth is, no one knows your exact answer for most of this stuff because you have not shared with them what your personal situation is. So most of the people who are giving you these exact, precise answers to go do X, it's bullshit. How could it possibly fit your situation when they don't know you at all? Right? So you got to go speak to a professional, be honest with them. Right? I don't know why people hire professionals, pay them all that money, and then lie to them. We've had that happen a couple times. That will get you jammed up. Be honest with them, and they can figure out the best way to work with you. If you lie to them about something and they proceed based on your lie, you're going to get jammed up. Watching from Namibia. Hey, what's going on in Namibia? You're going to have to do that work yourself. Namibia is a cool place, though. Empty, but cool. I'm okay with empty, by the way. I don't like crowds anymore. All right. So we understand how that works. One of the things with trust is the trust as a legal document is the most versatile and flexible legal document in the world, right? There is no more flexible legal document except possibly a constitution, right? A trust is the most versatile, most flexible legal document that can be drafted. Okay, so it can do anything, even illegal things, right? But when it does illegal things, what ends up happening is a judge will invalidate the trust, right? It's like the trust goes to jail. It's actually like the trust gets executed, right? They'll just destroy it. But it can be set up that way, and then it'll be invalidated, of course, but it can happen, is the point, right? It is the most flexible document in existence. You also want to make sure that it can correct things that become illegal later, right? Because that happens sometimes, right? So what's an example of that? An example of that is bonus depreciation in the United States. It used to be that you could do bonus depreciation, which meant that as like you could buy something and take 27 years of depreciation or 26 and a half years of depreciation or whatever in the first year. It's called bonus depreciation. Well, that went away and it got brought back. Trump brought it back, right? But it went away for a while, right? So if you had a trust that managed a bunch of properties, and then in the trust deed, it said, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to, buy a distressed property. It has to be this far below market rate, percentage wise. After you buy that property, you're going to rehab it. After you rehab it, you're going to get a cash out refinance. After you get the cash out refinance, you're going to do a cost segregation study, and you're going to get bonus depreciation on all of them for tax time. And then you're going to take, 75% of the money made on that, and you're going to go do it again, right? That's a very high level overview of a strategy called burring, right? So let's say your trust was actually set up to do that, okay? But now bonus depreciation has disappeared, but the trust deed orders the trustee to implement bonus depreciation in the tax strategy, right? So your trust has to be set up so that when things like that are gone, you can't do them anymore, and they're now illegal, an adjustment can be made in the trust that says, okay, because of this law or this expiring of, an act or whatever, this portion of the orders in the trust deed are no longer viable under law. If the law changes back, then you reactivate it. But that should go to sleep while it's illegal, right? So those things, it's not like crazy stuff. It's not like, narcotics or something like that. It's not, that type of breaking the law. It might be something that is completely innocent, that gets taken away from the tax code or gets taken away from limited liability or gets taken away from business law or real estate law or whatever, that now you have to deal with. So if the is going to be a perpetual trust, which means that it lives forever, it has to be able to adapt to new laws, right? So that mechanism has to be in there. Well, if you're alive, then you can make yourself what's called an enforcer, right? If you're the trust enforcer and you're alive, then obviously you can just tell the trustee, hey, listen, this is what I meant. So when you change it, it's this. If you're not alive, then you have to, you have to depend on the future generations. But the part of the trust that's easy is the money. The hard part is the education, and that's the part that most people neglect, and that's why 75% of generational wealth trusts die in the first generation, and then of the 25% that survive the first generation, 50% of them die in the second generation, right? Most of those deaths can be attributed to lack of education. And so we've seen thousands, if not tens of thousands, of trusts over the last 12 years, and in maybe 20% of them are educational requirements. And not you need to go to college in order for us to give you some of this money. No, we're talking about, do you know what stewardship is? Stewardship is the number one differentiator between rich people and wealthy people. Do you know what it is? Right? If not, then our children need to be taught that, right? Or the beneficiaries of the trust need to be taught that, right? They need to understand what it is so that they can maintain the generational wealth. Do they have financial literacy? If not, they need to be taught that. Who's going to teach them? Not you, right? Because you ain't got the financial literacy either, right? So the trust has to be set up to bring in that education and make sure that those beneficiaries, typically in a family trust, your heirs, your own children, gain that education, right? So the trust itself will, in time, hire the professionals in to do that, right? It's like there's one of our trusts that has its annual meeting in Mauritius every year, because the trust is in Mauritius. It's a Mauritius asset protection trust, not really a generational wealth trust. But even in that asset protection trust, education is part of the trust, you know, for all of the beneficiaries who are coming into that trust and will benefit from it. So what ends up happening is the trust actually flies out every year Ivy League professors to teach economics, to teach socioeconomics, to teach even politics. Like all of this education is built into the trust. And if you don't participate in the education, you get kicked out as a beneficiary, right? In order to qualify as a beneficiary, you have to go through the education, right? So they're getting Harvard professors that teach, you know, MBAs at Harvard, the school that invented MBA, to fly into Mauritius, not a bad deal. Bring your whole family, have a week vacation on us, but on the weekend we're having the annual meeting of the family trust, and we need you to take the 12, 13, and 14-year-old kids and teach them, you know, what you would teach in your MBA 101 class. You know what I mean? Or your economics 101 or your finance 101, right? We need you to do that. And then we need you to come back next year and the year after that. We need 201, 301, 401. We need a full education by the time these kids are 18 of financial literacy, macroeconomics, socioeconomics, finance, the whole nine. Everything you don't know, the trust will have enough money to pay people to teach, right? So that's what sets aside the trusts that just fail, which is the vast majority of them, because all they're thinking about is money, which is the easiest part of the trust. Compounding is stupid easy. As long as you don't touch the money, it's guaranteed to grow, right? So compounding is stupid easy. The money part is stupid easy, right? It's the education that sets apart wealth from possibly just rich, right? Rich is just you have more passive income coming in than your monthly burn rate. So your monthly passive income is higher than your monthly burn rate. We can make you rich right now if you get our bond ladder. If you do our relocation and you get our bond ladder, the bonds will pay you every month more money than it costs for you to live here every month. You'll immediately be rich. That's rich. It's passive. Your passive income, not your employment income. Your passive income is higher than your bills and your monthly burn rate. You're rich. Okay? That has nothing to do with being wealthy. Right? So, in order to instill that, especially if you don't know it, there has to be a mechanism within the trust that once the trust compounds enough money, it spends some of that money to educate the beneficiaries, right? And then you can start actually building a dynasty. Right? So the formal education is necessary. Beyond the formal education that's necessary, you need hands-on education that's necessary. Right? Um, so, you know, you can't build wealth thinking that everything is going to be philosophical. It's not going to work. So typically what ends up happening is the trust will eventually acquire some operating companies where the trust will own those operating companies and the beneficiaries will have internships at those operating companies, right? So they'll be able to intern at the company that, you know, the trust owns and move forward from there. So they get their hands-on experience, they get their philosophic experience, and then they may get some practical experience from a situation where there's ownership built into the family, right? So you can have a family trust situation where elders in the family are required to mentor juniors in order for them to maintain status as a trust beneficiary. So if they don't step up and mentor the next generation, they might get cut off from the trust and they stop getting, you know, monetary distributions, right? So you have to set it all up so that you set up the next generations for success and not failure. Can't just be money. Here's $1 million. Daddy took really good care of you. Look at that. $1 million in your bank account when you're 21. Have fun. That doesn't work, right? You have to make sure that they understand what money really is, how it works, the systems that utilize it, and how those systems utilize it. What is GDP? What is ROI? Right? What is finance versus funding? You know, all of those things are things that have to get passed on to those next generations to give them, the tools to succeed. Any questions on that? Right. Now, our family trust fund waterfall meeting is tonight. So probably tomorrow I'll have some breakdown stuff that I can throw up. We always throw up maybe 1 or 2 pages from the meeting so you can see what happened with other folks that are actually doing this. And so there'll be like a case study where you can see, you won't get to know who the people are, but you can see what someone else's trust has done who's using this methodology. And so that breakdown will be tonight because the special is running, which will give some of our other trust fund clients a chance to buy into the bond laddering and go ahead and supercharge their trust. This may be the last year for the bond laddering, and then we'll be implementing new strategies and we'll adapt to the market. But the interest rates on the bonds are going to normalize eventually. This might be the last year. It might be the second to last year. We don't think it's going to last too much longer. We've had a really, really good bond run since 2022. And, if we're lucky, it'll last till 2027. But it may only last till 2026. So we'll see. But it's been a great run. There's been quite a few trusts that utilize those bonds to really get their trusts all the way up to 6 figures, and even one up to 7. The risk. Yeah, the risk factor. What's so great about the bonds? The risk factor. So your risk in that investment is incredibly limited if you hold bond to maturity, right? There are some additional risks if you try to like do stuff before it matures. Then you typically will always lose money doing that. So that's not, part of the strategy at all. I get it. People, you know, have medical complications and stuff like that and need to do whatever it is they need to do. That's an extraordinary circumstance. But typically, people going into bonds, where they're higher ROI like investments that we've seen our trust people, get involved with. We don't do like investment programs in that way, but of course, we've seen the trustee follow the trust deed and make investments, with the profits in the trust, and we've seen the investments that they've requested the trustee to make. And so, were there some, better investments as far as ROI is concerned? Sure, but they were also riskier, right? So there was a chance of losing everything, or making 20% versus like one of our bonds was doing 18.46%. So we did 18.46%. It's actually 18.4607% on a relatively safe, treasury bond guaranteed by the government versus doing 20% in like Oak Special Fund. It's not guaranteed by the government that get wiped out, at any moment, right? So it's typically a matter of risk tolerance. You get a much less riskier, investment vehicle in a government bond versus options or derivatives or stocks, um, and you still get about the same, interest, right? So we've seen a spread between 12 and 19%, right, on the bond interest rates, which is pretty incredible. So that's typically what has been the big deal with the bonds over the past couple of years. That's also why it's not going to last. That's not normal for a bond. The reason it exists now is because there's a bunch of development projects within the country because it's a developing country. So when there's a bunch of developmental projects going on, the government will borrow money from the people to fund the development projects, and that's what a government bond is, right? It's the government using you as a bank and then paying the interest, the bank loan interest to you, right? And so that's why they're so good right now. But once a country develops, like the United States, and that's when the bond rates bottom out. And then it's something that like only old people use because they don't want to lose their retirement. You know what I mean? So the older you get, the more bond, percentage is typically in your portfolio because you're getting too close to retirement to be rolling the dice on the stock market. In this case, the bonds are actually high enough in their return on investment that it makes sense to just go after them. And possibly for our relocation clients, a bunch of them have just essentially retired. Like they'll just have enough bonds that they can live off of the bonds. And then those bonds are very long, 20-year bonds. There's even 30-year bonds. So they know that they don't have to work for like the next 10, 15 years. And so, of course, they put things in place during that time to make sure that they're okay once the bonds are done. Because once the bonds are done, you don't know what the interest rates will be. It might be another season of incredible interest rates, but probably not, right? So you would have to find something else to invest in because you get your principal back. And sometimes you get that principal back amortized. So sometimes you get the principal back over time sooner than the maturity of the bond, right? And so then you're getting your principal back in like chunks, like a third of it, another third of it, the final third of it type of thing. So you just have to make that plan of like, okay, I have freedom for the next 10 to 15 years. And within that freedom, I'm going to build out X, Y, and Z so that I have those multiple streams of income. And that's how folks do it. You'll hear people say things out of context like, oh, rich people have 7 streams of income. And then you got these people running around with like chickens with their head cut off trying to get 7 streams of income. But that's actually bullshit, right? Rich people get rich with 1 stream of income. And once they're rich, they diversify for what's called capital preservation. They diversify into 7 streams of income, right? So literally, what our program does for those relocatees, they become rich, right? What's rich? Their passive income is greater than they spend every month. So that makes them rich. Not your employment income, your passive income, right? So by getting the bond ladder, they're getting passive income from the government. They're getting a check every month from the government as the ROI on the bond that they bought. And as long as that passive income is more than they spend every month here, which is what we target for, they become rich. Okay, great. Now you're rich. How do you become wealthy? That's when you diversify into 7 streams of income after you're already rich. You only get rich on one, right? So again, a lot of the stuff that's just repeated as a soundbite is repeated without nuance, and as such, just becomes bullshit, right? So make sure that you understand the nuance of what it takes, to execute any of these strategies or whatever that you're looking at. And then the simpler the strategy, like this strategy, simpler the strategy, typically the more premium it costs, right? The simpler the strategy, normally the more expensive it is. The more complicated the strategy, it might go all the way down to, it costs nothing. But it's hard, hard work, and it's really complicated. And there's a lot of moving parts. And if any one of those moving parts fails, the whole thing fails, right? So essentially, the cheaper it is, typically the more difficult it is, or else everyone would be doing it, right? The easier it is, the more expensive it is, or else everybody would be doing it, right? So that's typically how that works. All right. Just so that you have like your logic straight when you hear something. Any questions on any of that? Any questions on any of that? That you don't understand how that works? Okay, so let me give you an example of how that works. We had a client, very atypical client, not a normal situation, but that client came over. He had like somewhere between like $8,000 and $9,000 to his name. We told him not to show up with that little amount of money. You're setting yourself up for failure. But he had grit for real. I think he might have had more grit than me. For he seriously had grit. In 12 years, we've never seen anything like him, right? And so what he did with zero money was he went and he made friends with coffee farmers in I guess that's Western Kenya. I always think of it as Northern, but it's not. I guess it's actually Western Kenya. This place called Kericho. He made friends with these coffee farmers up there. He used a Google Voice on Wi-Fi, so he didn't pay for any phone calls. He started calling these companies in the United States. I got the best coffee beans in the world, da, 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 right? He got told and kept track, right? Hashing on the wall, kept track of how many times he got told no. He got told no 1,000 times before he even figured out who his actual target client was, right? So he started with what seemed like the obvious choice, but in hindsight was the dumbest thing you could have done, right? Started with like Walmart in that. Well, Walmart's like, no, no, no. We have corporate buyers. Like we have a procurement division. We can't like buy coffee beans from you over the phone. What are you talking about, right? So, which is like duh, looking back on it, but he just started somewhere, right? Like I said, boy got grit. And he started calling. In the end, he figured out that you know what the target client is? It's small coffee shops that are typically not even coffee shop focused. They're bakery focused, right? But what they do is they have a coffee roaster in the shop where they roast coffee every morning. And people in the community smell that beautiful roasted coffee aroma and they come in. And then the people who sit there all day ordering coffee all day are coffee snobs, right? So they know coffee was invented in Ethiopia. They know Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Jamaica, Colombia has the best coffee in the world. They know this. Most people, Dunkin' Donuts people don't know that, right? So he realized, okay, that's my target. Got told no over 1,000 times before he figured out this is the actual market. Zeroed in on that, ended up 27 deals, absolutely no money, all over the phone. Got purchase orders from these TikTok and its damn challenge. Give me 1 second to fill out this puzzle. All right, TikTok and its challenges. So ended up calling those folks, got purchase orders from them. All right, he ain't got no money. Got purchase orders from these folks. Brought the purchase orders to XM Bank. XM Bank did due diligence on the purchase orders, financed the entire deal, did a $1.28 million deal his first time through. Took 18 months. Got told no over 1,000 times in 12 months. Right? Cussed out sometimes. Told he was a scammer. Hung up on all of that. Every single day, 12 hours a day. No days off, no Christmas, none of that. Calling. While his $9,000, that's all the money he has in his life, is being eaten away every month while he's living here. Right? So that's the kind of work that goes into no money. Very, very difficult. Had the farmers effed up, not giving him the beans, all would have fell apart. Right? Had the ship, sinked at sea, all would have fell apart. Right? So when the cheaper it is, the more moving parts there is, the harder it is. Again, which is why everybody doesn't do it. Right? And if anything, any one piece of that complicated moving structure goes down, the whole thing goes down. Get it now? Now, opposite example, right? That if it's easy, it's expensive. Okay? Opposite example. And even easy takes work, right? But opposite example, you want a McDonald's. You got to have $1 million net worth. You got to have $1 million in the bank and another $1 million in reserve, so that if your McDonald's isn't making money, because McDonald's sees it as like a knock on their brand. If you open one and then it goes out of business, they can't allow that, right? So you need to have about $3 million up front and $1 million to run it at a loss, because you have to keep it open for a certain amount of time, or else McDonald's feels like it hurts their image. So you need to be able to run that McDonald's while you're not making any money, okay, which probably isn't going to happen, let's face it, but it needs to be there, and you need all this money to get involved, right? Once you get involved, is it a turnkey thing? Is it virtually a sure thing? Are you going to make money at your McDonald's? Yes, you are. Super easy. You got all the support in the world. You got managers coming in from corporate training all your people for all of that. Pretty easy, but you need about $3 million to get started, right? Which again is why everybody isn't doing it, because they ain't got that money, right? So those are the two sides of the spectrum. It can be very easy, but then it costs money. It can be very, very hard, and it might not cost anything, blood, sweat, and tears, and possibly your sanity, right? So the hardest thing you're ever going to do in life is going to be essentially the bootstrap, right? And the easiest thing that you're ever going to do in life is going to be deploy capital, right? Still risking both. Even the easy side where you deploy capital can fail, right? Even the hard side where you do all the work, all the sweat, all the blood, all the tears, all the consistency, you did everything right, read all the books, did all of that, still fail. So the risk of failure is still there on both sides. All right. But that's typically how they relate to each other. It makes sense now. Okay. So you have to be no, because it's a different country. If you were going to bond ladder in the United States and you were going to buy US trade bonds and ladder them and then quit working, yes, you would have to be rich. In order to put enough money into those bonds to be able to live the rest of your life, or even 10 years without working, yes, you would have to be rich. But because you're going to a different country where the currency power is different, right? And the currency exchange is different. You can do it for less. So that's why our clients are able to spend $85,000 and not have to work for 10 years. That's like a no-brainer. If you have the 85,000, if you just ain't got it, you ain't got it. You know what I mean? But if you can spend $85,000, right? Like the cost of a Mercedes, you know what I mean, and not have to work for 10 years, it's a no-brainer, right? So, but when you convert that currency, if you had the equivalent of that in US dollars living in the US, you'd be able to do the same thing, right? Because when you convert that currency, you're talking about having like $8 to $9 million. So if you had $8 to $9 million in the U.S., you would also be able to live off of the interest. You'd be able to ladder that up, and so it's the exact same thing. You're just cheating by, going somewhere where your money is bigger, right? Skipping having to earn $8 or $9 million, you just turn your currency into a currency where your money is already $8 or $9 million, and you're good. Well, buying power matters because there are actually African countries where the percentage is actually higher, right? Like Nigeria. Nigeria, there are bonds where you can get like 27%, but the cost of living is drastically different, right? So even if you're getting that 27% in their currency, you still can't do the same thing with the same amount of money and live for X amount of years off of their bonds because of cost of living. So cost of living matters as well. You got to find the perfect storm. You got to, do the due diligence to find the perfect storm. And so that's why a lot of folks really like our firm, because I've already done it. I'm sitting here in Kenya, living off of those types of investments and all of that. So we've already done it. We've already, shown that it works. And so it's like, all right, cool. The cost of living, I'm sure I can get by with that. So that's essentially How that's done. It won't last. Not on the bond side. When we first started, the bonds were not available at this level, so we were using a different strategy. And it just so happened that as the bond strategy became viable, the other strategy became not viable anymore, right? And so strategies will change over time, but for right now, the bonds are still viable. Will not last long. I'll be really, really surprised if it lasts 2 years. Really surprised. I expect it to last 1 year, but nobody knows. Wish I did know. Be super rich, but nobody knows what the market's going to do. That's why they're fair. Nobody knows what it's going to go up, going to go down. And for the folks that know about individual things, they're not allowed to tell. That's called insider trading. No, no. The comment was, are there payment plans? No, they're not. Because how would you get the bonds then? Right? If it's on a payment plan and the money's not there to acquire the bond, how would you get it if you're trying to break, you know, the payments down? Now, can you do that with generational wealth? Like if you're using a bond ladder to push generational wealth, could you do it? But yeah, you probably could, right? Because the trust is going to be doing the generational wealth push over the next 20 years or whatever, right? So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's all there at once. The risk in that, though, is as you keep making payments, you may erode the non-grantor status. So the IRS might look at the payment plan as you're moving American assets into that trust. Whereas when you buy the package is paid before the trust exists, right? Because you're paying for the creation of the trust, right? So the package is a service fee paid to an American company, right, in the United States of America, and then the trust is created as a result of that service fee, right, under that service level agreement. So once the trust is created and it buys its own bonds, you didn't send the payment to do that, right? That it did on its own after its creation. So in that sense, the non-grantor trust has always been a non-grantor trust since the first day, you know, of its creation. But if you're sitting there after the trust exists and is funded, and you're making payments into the trust, you're probably going to lose non-grantor status, and then you're going to have a shit ton of IRS forms to fill out. And if you miss one of them, trying to think what the lowest fine, I think it's $10,000. So the lowest fine that you're looking at if you screw that up is 10 grand. The highest fine I think is 50% of the value, which is crazy. But yeah, you know. So typically non-grantor is the way to go, as long as it's legitimate. And again, that affects Americans primarily. So we have a bunch of British clients and Canadian clients that are like, oh yeah, what do I have to do about that? Nothing. It only affects Americans. Hey Nicole, what Nicole is that? Is that my cousin Nicole? Okay, no. Because Americans, Eritreans, and North Koreans are the only people, or the only country who tax their citizens based on their passport. Some other countries will talk about worldwide income, but that only applies when you're a tax resident to that country. And typically there's all sorts of caveats to that, right? So most countries, while you're in the country, we'll talk about, well, it's like you live here, but you have a remote job, I don't know, in China or something. You got to pay your taxes here, right? That's typical. But those three countries will charge you tax if you leave the country, move somewhere else, become a tax resident somewhere else, and are paying taxes somewhere else. There's a tax filing requirement from only those three countries. Are the only three in the world that do that, and America just happens to be one of them. So yeah, very different for UK. What about Dubai? Those three countries are only three countries in the world, right? So if you're not in those three countries, if you're not Eritrean, North Korean, or American, you don't have to worry about it. No problem. Oh, thanks for the gift. Yeah, but that's not their national. Oh, Jesus. All right. Canadians are also in North America. Yes, but that's not their nationality. Their nationality is Canadian. On their passport, it says that they're Canadian. Nations are allowed to decide what their nationality is called. All right. So when Americans say that they're Americans, they're not saying that other people on the American continent are not from the American continent. They're saying that when you look at their passport, under the section that says nationality, it says American. That's their nationality, not their geographical region, right? So Canadians are in the geographical region of North America, but it is not their nationality. We're talking about immigration here. So we're only worried about nationality. What does it cost to set up a trust? It depends on which kind of trust, right? Typically, we deal with generational wealth trusts the most. So if the trust is fully funded, it'll cost about 10 grand. If the trust is not fully funded and it's just formed, it can be as low as like six, and then you just go from there. So in the grand scheme of things, not too extraordinary. If you're doing like Google searches on trusts, the trusts that investment bankers and like JP Morgan and those people like to set up are typically asset protection trusts, right? So those trusts, those are when you'll see the search results that are like, you need to have $500,000, you need $10 million, blah 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 blah. That's actually a like a business structure, right? So what they're looking at is they're saying, okay, we charge, I don't know, we charge 3% of the value of the trust that we manage annually. And so what we need as a business is $100,000 for every customer. Any customer we onboard, we're JP Morgan, we want $100,000 or we're not doing business with them, right? And so they calculate it out. How much money do we want to make a year? How many clients is that if each client is worth $100,000 base? Okay, so we only accept 300 people a year and they have to have a minimum of $100 million in assets. That's why you get those results, and that's why people think you have to be rich to get a trust. It has nothing to do with the trust, it has everything to do with the profit structure of the asset manager that's offering you this asset protection trust, right? So if it's just the the trust, it really depends on what you're doing with the trust and what that profit breakdown is from the asset manager or the investment banker or the law firm or whoever it is that's offering that particular product, right? But for us, Generational wealth trusts are for people who don't have no money yet. They're creating generational wealth for the next generation, right? At the risk that they themselves will never have wealth, right? So, a lot of folks that do a generational wealth trust, they themselves do not benefit from the trust. It's the next generation that benefits from the trust, right? So those are not millionaires and multimillionaires and doing, I need to protect my $10 million of assets, offshore and wherever. These are like normal people that are creating, a generational wealth plan so that their kids, their grandkids don't have to have the same financial hardships that they've had. So it doesn't play out the same in kind of that pricing strategy. So it's a whole lot cheaper, to do that than it is to do, an asset protection trust. Even with us, if we do an asset protection trust, it's like man, between 10 million in assets and 50 million in assets, it's like $30,000 because it's complicated. You got to do a complicated offshore trust. We would probably put that trust in Mauritius unless there's some special feature to the assets that they have or whatever, you know what I mean? And if there's that, it gets even more expensive. And so the more complicated the trust is, the more expensive it gets. But generational wealth trust is really affordable. Yeah, no, definitely. You had the trust deed is a document, the legal document that governs the trust, and it's registered, right? And that's you can kind of like go after. You'll hear a lot of people like, oh, you don't have to register the trust, the private trust, the. Yes, sure, you can just write a trust and have it in your house and in a drawer somewhere, and that's fine. But once you pass and the trust is now irrevocable and there has to be a trustee who's not you to manage that trust, how do you check the trustee? How can you enforce that the trustee isn't taking the money in your trust and doing whatever they want with it and not doing it the way that you wanted them to do it if it's some private document in a safe somewhere, right? So when you register a legitimate trust, that trust deed is on file somewhere so that if somebody comes in and does something funky with your money or a trustee misappropriates funds, you can actually go to court and point to the trustee and say, you see, the trustee wasn't supposed to take the money and do that. The trustee is supposed to take the money and give it to my kids. And then the court puts that trustee in jail, for fiduciary misconduct. And then that's that, right? So the trust deed is something that you would sit down with our lawyers and figure out, and then from there, that trustee would manage the entire trust. Does it keep you from paying? No. Tax is a trust is a tax neutral formation, right? So the people that are talking about using trust specifically for anything with taxes, are there sometimes tax benefits? Sometimes. But a trust is a tax neutral formation. If you go look up what the tax brackets are for a trust versus a regular person, the trust hits the maximum like 37% tax bracket at like $14,000. Right? So trusts, if they're going to be utilized that way, become horrific for taxes because you'll end up paying way more taxes. Now, this is an offshore trust, so it's bound by the tax rules of the company of the country that it's formed in. But if you're American, you got to pay taxes on everything, right? So then we got to make sure that works out well. That's why we focus on non-grantor trust, because a non-grantor trust has no tax impact on the person who created the trust. And it doesn't have a tax impact on the beneficiary until they take a distribution from the trust. We utilize the country of Kenya because when you take a distribution from a Kenyan trust, the first 10 million every year is tax exempt on the Kenyan side, right? So when an American takes that distribution, yes, they may have a tax burden with the distribution they take, but only in America, right? So we're not doing things just willy nilly and just happen to be in Kenya. We chose strategic places that have strategic trust laws that allow us to not get double hit for taxes. But as far as, a tax liability that you already have, trying to use a trust as some kind of structure to remove tax liability is a ridiculous idea. So anybody on TikTok or anywhere else telling you that a trust saves you in taxes has just proven that they know absolutely nothing about how trusts work in the U.S. tax system, right? So just be careful with that stuff. And typically, like, you can go to the IRS's website, just go to the little search bar and type that in, right? Trust to avoid taxes, and watch the law that pops up, right? Probably describing exactly what you heard somebody say to use a trust for. But definitely don't do that. If you want to save on taxes, that's what companies are for, right? So companies can help you save on taxes if you structure them properly. Foundations can help you save on taxes if you structure them properly. My personal favorite, private operating foundations can help you save on taxes if you structure them properly. So there's all kinds of other formations that can help you, handle tax liability. It's just that a trust isn't one of them. Now, a trust can own those formations, right? So a trust can be at the top of your financial structure, right? But the trust itself is not going to help you save on taxes. All right. Or at least not directly. Well, it's just not a good strategic structure for that. You also got to remember that there's a seasoning period on trust, and sometimes a look back period, right? So if you create a trust as a response to something, it typically invalidates the entire trust, right? So, and we see this all the time, especially like with marriages. Trusts are typically more powerful than prenups, right? But if you get engaged and as a reaction to your engagement create a trust, even if the divorce is 20 years later, the trust will be invalidated because you did it reactionarily to the engagement, right? Now, we had one of our very first trust clients. They set up a generational wealth trust for their kids. I remember we were talking about the education that needs to happen because the money is the easy part. So we got into the education that needs to happen to make sure that that trust, maintains. And so their trust owns a company. The company does great work, right? And at a certain age, they get to intern for that company. Remember, we said you got to have the hands-on experience and all of that. So they're doing all of that, right? Great. So the kid does his internship at the age of 16 when he's, allowed to work as a juvenile. They maintain all the laws. He can only work so many hours. He's interning, at 16 years old, minimum wage. 17 years old, minimum wage. 18 years old, minimum wage, right? Now, this just happened by happenstance. He keeps working for the company, and the company has corporate perks that other employees also take advantage of, not just him. That's important. All right. And so part of the corporate perks are corporate housing. You have the corporate car service, right? So every 2 years, the lease gets renewed and you get a new car and you live in this nice house. All right, great. So somebody notices, hey, this young guy, he has a new car every 2 years. He lives in a really nice house. So by 20, he is married to this knockout. She's incredible looking, right? By 21, there's a baby and she's filing for divorce. She wants the house, she wants the cars, she wants the everything, right? They get to court. He doesn't own the house, never has. And he did not create the trust. It wasn't in a response to her. The parents created the trust for the kids, right? Long before they had ever met. He had been making minimum wage for 4 or 5 years before they ever met. So guess what happened? The judge said, all right, cool. You don't get the house. You don't get the car because they're not his. And based on his income, you get $50 a month in child support. Clients reported that she gave him custody of the child, went found some other man, apparently told that other man she'd never had a child and never been married, and 2 years later took him for half of everything he owned because he didn't have the protection, right? Now, had they gotten married and in response to the engagement, he opened a trust, the judge would have penetrated that trust, said this is all bullshit, and gave her everything. Right? So it's a matter of setting up your protection way before anything happens. That's what makes it bulletproof. Okay? So how do you do that for taxes? How would you know 4 years before you owe taxes that you're going to owe those specific taxes? See why it's not a good vehicle for that? Right? Your trust structure has to be in place long before anything happens. That's the only time it works. All right? So if you do it as a response to something, it won't work. A judge will just invalidate it and it'll be like you never even had a trust, which can cause other problems, right? Because when that judge invalidates it, certain things might shoot back into your ownership and the tax authority of your country might see that as a capital gain, right? So that in and of itself might have a host of other problems. There's also things like Medicaid, right? People will get old, they'll need assisted living facilities, they'll need things like that. In order to qualify under the U.S. system, you can't have but so much assets, and if you do, they come and they take them, right? So like Medicaid can actually come like take your house because your parent needed assisted living or an old folks home or something like that that you couldn't afford. They can actually come take your inheritance. They can take that old person's house to pay for the old folks home. So there are trusts that are designed so that when those people need that extra help, they can get it and not lose their house and all of that stuff. But there's a 5-year look back period. So you have to create those kind of trusts more than 5 years before the elderly parents ever need it, right? Which takes their house and all their assets out of their ownership and puts it in the ownership of the trust years before they ever need it in order for that to work, because there's a look back period where the government's allowed to look back, and if you made a move or a change within that look back period, they can legally undo it, right? So just understanding how trusts actually work, it now becomes obvious that it's not the appropriate vehicle to accomplish what that viewer was just asking about, because you would have to be Nostradamus. You would have to know in advance that was coming in order to do it legitimately, which is why the generational wealth trusts are so powerful, because they've existed sometimes before the beneficiary was alive, right? Sometimes it's like, okay, I don't have any kids yet, but I'm going to set up this generational wealth trust because eventually I want to have kids, and my kids are going to be the beneficiaries, and they're going to get this education, and they're going to get stewardship and financial literacy, and these are the protections that are in place, right? And then when it comes to a situation like the one I just described, the judge looks at it and is like, this trust has been in existence longer than the kid's been alive, and they didn't create the trust. They're just the beneficiary of it. So they did not create this trust to defraud you from your maritable property or defraud a creditor from collecting a debt. At that point, that trust is rock solid because they weren't even involved in creating it at all, and it's been in existence for so long. So that's why those big family trusts are like the Kennedy Family Trust, rock solid. No one can break into that anymore. That the risk of that was in the first generation. Now it's solid, right? So that's what you want. And that's why generational wealth trusts are so powerful, because by the time your kids engage with the world, you've actually protected them from damn near everything, that a person could do to them, right? Like civil type of stuff, right? And so now that's actually become part of how that family now handles, their generational wealth trust. Now every member of the family makes minimum wage. Like now that's just something they do. That was like a mistake when it happened, but it really worked into their favor. So now every member of the family makes minimum wage, right? And the trust, not even the trust directly, but the companies that the trust owns have those corporate benefits, and those corporate benefits are available for, all of the C-suite or like managerial positions within those corporations. So anyone who's a manager or C-suite or however they form those companies can get corporate housing. They can get the car lease. So it's also not specific to just those kids, but there's other people working in the company, but those people don't get the corporate benefit. Well, then it's not a corporate benefit, right? So everything has to be real. You can't play these games where you create these special rules for you, because it won't pass form over function. It has to be legit, right? And then you go from there. So that's where the planning really, really matters. As you plan it out, the longer you plan it out, the more legit it gets. So age makes it more legit. No, the things that you have to do over time makes it more legit, right? Bank statements for the last 20 years makes it more legit. Meeting minutes, you have to do your annual meetings at a minimum. Annual meetings, you should be doing quarterly meetings, but there should be meeting minutes for your annual meetings at a minimum, makes it more legit. Paying taxes every year, right? For that corporate structure, there's corporate taxes, or at least filing tax returns every year makes it more legit, right? Having invoices and work orders and service level agreements for the last 20 years makes it more legit, right? So it's not just time. It's not like a shelf company where, you just leave it on the shelf for 20 years and now you say it's legit because it's 20 years old. No. Actually, that might make it illegitimate if it's a shelf company, right? So no, it's you actually engaging in corporate normality for however long you've had the structure running. And the longer you do that, the more legit it is. Hey, Jay Rivera, what's going on, man? Good to see you, brother. Hey, Sharon. Is Sharon not there? Okay. Even if, well, yeah, but in this context, that wouldn't really apply now, would it? But yes, even if you're a solopreneur, yes. But if you're creating a generational wealth system, and part of that system is that your beneficiaries can intern at your business, even if you are a solopreneur, they're still interning for you, right? So yeah, it would still be valid. Things are definitely weaker, like from a court perspective. Things do from time to time get weaker when you're a solopreneur, in the sense that a lot of rules are designed to protect additional shareholders, right? So if you have, I don't know, a personal creditor, and that personal creditor sues you for default, and gets a judgment, right? And then you're a member at a limited partnership, right? There are partners. There are other partners at that limited partnership, right? So since there are other partners at that limited partnership, they need to be protected from this judgment, right? So this judgment happens, and then the courts take a look at it, and they're like, okay, this guy owes the debt, and they're coming after him now, and they want to come after the company. But in the company, there are four other partners, right? Hey, how's it going from Edmonton, California, or Canada? I'm sorry, Edmonton, Canada. So there are these other partners in the company. Those partners need to be protected through the limited liability from this guy's debt, right? See how that works? So they might say, okay, you're going to be able to collect on this judgment by way of a charging order, right? What does a charging order do? Charging order protection is going to say, all right, look, whenever there's a distribution from the company to the partners or the shareholders or the whatever, you can intercept this specific individual's distribution, right? Nothing else. Okay? And that protects, obviously, the other people. Now, what happens when the same judge looks at the situation and says, well, there's no one here to protect, right? Yes, there's a limited liability structure here, but you're the only one in it. There are no partners to protect. What happens then? Right? So in some states, they've been doing something called piercing the corporate veil, right? Where the judge is like, you know what? There's really no difference between you and this LLC because there's no one, you don't have any partners, you don't have any employees, there's no one to protect. It's just you. So I'm just going to go ahead and pierce the veil, right? And just essentially crack the limited liability open and give those creditors access to whatever's in the LLC to satisfy the judgment, right? The other thing is that you're always the weak link in limited liability, right? If you own the shares of that corp or the membership units of that LLC directly, there's no limited liability protecting the shares. So if a judgment is won against you and you don't have the money to cover the judgment, or your insurance policy doesn't cover the judgment, those shares can be valued and the actual shares can be given to whoever won the judgment against you, right? That's why a lot of folks, the shares of their company are in their trust. So if they get into a car accident or if somebody slips and falls, walking up their step to knock on their front door, and they slip and fall on the ice after a snow and they sue and your homeowner's insurance can't cover the damage, their shares don't get eaten up by that lawsuit because they don't own them personally, right? So it depends on just how much planning you've done in advance and what you have to plan for, right? If you don't have very much to plan for, it doesn't make sense to create an entire structure to protect nothing, right? So you got to have something. If you're going to do an asset protection structure, you got to have some assets to protect, right? If you're going to do a generational wealth structure, that's designed to build the assets. So you don't have to have anything, but the money it takes to make the structure for the generational wealth. And then you let it create assets. And then the next generation should then create an asset protection trust, that will then handle direct asset protection from there on. But that's essentially how that goes. So you don't want to be making stuff in advance of you having anything unless the purpose of it is to create something. And typically, businesses create assets. However, in a generational wealth trust, what you're doing is compounding an insignificant asset, essentially, in the grand scheme of things. Like even $10,000 is insignificant in the grand scheme of things, right? Like if you're trying to leave money to your grandkids, how many of them are there going to be, right? So let's just say there's 4 of them, right? 60 years from now, right? As far as the age for them to get the distribution. So, if you don't have any kids yet, let's say your kids, get to 25, 30 before they have kids, right? And then those kids get to the same age before the distribution starts. Okay? So you got 60 years before that money hits them. And there's $10,000 in there and it didn't grow at all. There's 4 of them. So 60 years later, we all understand how inflation works. Each one of those kids as adults with families and possibly kids of their own, they get $2,500, and that's supposed to be significant? It's nothing, right? So the way it works is you put that $10,000 in, and that's, a large number for a lot of people. That by no means is the minimum situation, but let's just use that number. You put that $10,000 and you let it compound. You let it compound at 6% or at 10% annually, right? And so now, as it's compounding at this 10% annually, every year the number gets bigger, and then the percentage is based on the bigger number. That's how compounding works, right? So if the first year it was 10,000, and then you made 1,000, you made 10%, on the 10,000, right? So then you made 1,000. Well, the next year it's 11,000, right? And then you make 10% on that. So then the next year, it's 12,100 or whatever, and then you make. So eventually the money doubles, right? That's how compounding works. Starts off very slowly. First 20, 30, years, it's like, what's going on here, right? And then it hits where you get a full-on doubling, right? Where it went from that 10,000, maybe, 25 years later, maybe that 10,000 is just 90,000 or something like that. It's not a big deal. But then you get to a point where the 90,000 doubles, right? Now you're into six figures. Now the six figures starts doubling, right? Now you get into seven figures real quick. And once you hit seven figures and that doubling starts happening, sky's the limit, right? So that's why the time matters in the compounding. That's why something that's relatively insignificant, right? If you had it under your bed and all four of your grandkids got $2,500 60 years later, it's insignificant. That could turn into $2-3 million 60 years later, depending on the interest rate, which is incredibly significant, right? So that's why compounding matters, and that's why you could have a generational wealth trust and not have any assets or anything like that, but let the trust protect the insignificant asset that you put in there, right? So if you get in a car accident, all right, and you're doing the same thing. Let's say you're just doing the same thing in your bank account, which you could do, right? You can just buy your own stocks, buy your own bonds, do your own thing, have a brokerage account. Fine. Get in a car accident. They win the judgment against you. You own the brokerage account. Poof, there goes the generational wealth. That's why the offshore trust is there. The offshore trust is there as protection. You don't need an offshore trust to do it. The offshore trust makes sure no one can ever touch that money until it goes to your benefit, no matter what you do. No matter if you're arrested, no matter, if you get in a car accident, no matter if, there's a judgment against you, your creditors come after you, does not matter. No one can touch it. It's in a vault in another country, right? So that's the purpose of the offshore generational wealth trust, is to make sure that the generational wealth actually happens, right? And somebody doesn't slip and fall and rob your grandkids of their future, right? So yeah, you could do it, on your own, but it's at risk, plain and simple, right? So that's the way that works, all right? So those are kind of your two most common categories: asset protection trust, generational wealth trust, or dynasty trust, some people might call it, or all of that stuff. All of the names are just marketing, right? Even for us, generational wealth trust, that's marketing, right? It's an offshore irrevocable non-grantor trust. That's what it is, right? Might be the same thing as if the dynasty trust is offshore. That might be what the dynasty trust is also. The name that any of us ascribe to the trusts have no basis in law. You can't go into the law and look up a dynasty trust or anything like that. It's either a revocable trust or irrevocable trust, or testamentary trust, and it's either domestic or offshore. That's essentially, what it is. Typically, the names describe what the legal structure within the trust is designed to do. That's what the names should be. But someone could call it Millennium Falcon Platinum Trust. Well, you have no idea what the hell that does, right? So you could call it whatever you want. But typically, amongst sensible professionals, the name tells you what the trust actually physically does. So you'll see stuff like Medicare Protection Trust, right? Which is that situation we were just talking about, right? Dynasty Trust kind of lets you know that it's a family generational wealth trust of some sort, right? Spendthrift trust, that's typically a provision in a trust, right? So these things just tell you what's going on in those trusts, right? That's typically what, the name of the trust is, but it's not codified in law somewhere. And what's in the law is it's irrevocable, it's revocable or testamentary, it's grantor or it's non-grantor. Medicare clawback trust. Yeah, like that's some name that somebody put on it, right? Right. So yeah, but it lets you know what that trust is focused on, which is that one seems like it's focused on making sure that that Medicare can't take your house or your assets for an old person that received benefits on their Medicare, or even there are trusts that make you eligible for Medicare by removing certain assets. So you'll see Medicare eligibility trusts and things like that. And of course, a trust like that only matters to Americans. A Canadian that doesn't need that trust, right? So some trusts, the names are specific to the country in which they're being registered. Never heard of a testamentary trust? Yeah, they're not talked about all that much. A testamentary trust is a trust that actually exists within a will. So you can actually put a trust inside your will, and it doesn't exist until you die. So when you die, the testamentary trust activates. And then whatever you have in that testamentary trust, it would actually become an irrevocable non-grantor trust at that point. Because you're dead. Yeah, so the grantor can't touch it because you're dead. Yeah. Yeah, it's irrevocable because you're dead. You can't change it because you're dead. Yeah. So all testamentary trusts can be changed the entire time the person's alive, but they only come into effect when the person passes. No, you're absolutely right. So what ends up happening is with the testamentary trust, it's a catch-all for the things that typically there is another trust that exists, right? So it's a catch-all for the things that haven't happened yet with the trust that exists. So let's say like you're a real estate person, right? And you got multiple LLCs that have multiple Airbnbs, and they all get put into trusts or companies that are owned by trusts. You have this giant, elaborate, system, right? And you go out, you buy 5 new Airbnbs, and then you get a heart attack. So you've purchased these 5 new Airbnbs, but they're not in the structures yet. Why? Because it's way harder to get financing within the structures, right? So you buy them personally, you cash out, refinance, equity strip all the money out, then you put them in an LLC after the money is ripped out, right? So that's the procedure. So before that's happened, while they're still in your name, you die of a heart attack. Your testamentary trust will then get those properties into your structure because you died before you could, but you always intended to do so. See now where it makes sense? So if it's stuff that you're already planning, yes, you're absolutely right. You just do a living trust or do an irrevocable trust and just set it up. But things happen, right? You die before things happen. And so that's what the testamentary trusts are for. Yeah, well, it boils back down to having those professionals around because the professionals can predict things that you're not thinking about. You're not thinking about dying of a heart attack when you go to the gym, 5 days a week and you think you're in great health and maybe your cholesterol is through the roof and you don't even know it because maybe it's genetic, right? And you just never had the test because you're in such great shape, right? Happens all the time. Happens all the time. So it's for the professional to sit down and be like, look, these are the things that may or may not happen, and we're planning for them, whether you think that they're going to happen or not. Right? That's what the professional is supposed to do. They can be things that you've never heard of. Ah, you're welcome. I wouldn't mix. I wouldn't mix. Yeah, you want your trust to have a purpose, and you want that purpose to be the purpose. Period. The more things you mix, the more moving parts, the more gaps you may have in that formation. And so you may have more kind of almost like red team attacks, right? You might have more avenues of attack where someone's trying to invalidate the trust to get at what's inside of it, or trying to bust the trust open, or whatever. Um, you may have more of those issues if you have your trust doing multiple things. So just create a new trust for each thing that you need protection from. Oh, hold on one second. Yes. Hey, hey. Their number. Oh, right, because they need to know where to bring it. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead and send that to me. Uh huh. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Sometimes I gotta take the calls. Sharon, Carol, Caro. Where's Sharon? Oh, Shadow. Um, come grab a number from me. Yeah. All right. Sometimes business happens, guys. Sorry about that. She hasn't sent it yet. Just stand by and wait for it. Oh, there it is. Okay, take this number. Then he's gonna do a delivery for us. And tell him where we're at, and then make sure he knows uh, that we pay 200 for delivery. All right, back. See, it happens. It happens sometimes. Business intrudes. All right. So, any questions on that stuff that we were talking about before I had to do that little thing there? Any questions on that? It's from Java. Yeah, I will. For what? Tell them we're okay with 250. All right. Negotiations early in the morning. All right, so we all got that. We're all good with that. No questions on how the trust funds work. No, we don't. But we will refer you to somebody. Oh, so for the rest of you guys on the other live streams, the question was, do we do domestic U.S. trusts? We don't, because that should be done by a licensed professional in your state, not just in the United States, because there are tax implications that might be state level tax implications. So we do have a referral network, right? Our version of the bar is essentially connected to all other bar associations. And so we do have like a referral network where we can find a legitimate person in your state to assist you with setting up like a domestic, trust or any of that stuff. Or you just got to go find your own. But we only have licensed attorneys in Kenya. And in Mauritius and the Seychelles. So we do trusts in those three countries directly. Outside of that, we refer you to someone else. We don't operate in the United States as far as setting up the trust for people. There are other structures that we'll set up in the United States, but not a trust. Good question, though. Is what my logo? Oh, this? No, this is actually my family coat of arms. My logo is probably the picture that you're seeing as like the profile picture for whatever streaming social media platform that you're watching this on. Oh, that's a great question. Yes, it is trademarked. Who do you think owns it? You think I own it personally? Who do you think owns that trademark? Good question though. Can you be the beneficiary? Yes, you can be the beneficiary. And if you use like the bond laddering, it will still be a non-grantor trust. So yes, you can. You just can't be both. You can't be the beneficiary and the trustee. You really don't want to be the trustee, period. For some folks, it does make sense, but that's a discussion for your local tax people, and or your local lawyer, like whoever you lean on, whether it's your local attorney or your local tax people. But it's a discussion for your local people because there's implications, right? And there's local implications and federal implications. So you don't just want to talk to like your EA or something. You want to speak to the tax attorney that's in your area, right? So in your state, okay. But outside of that, yes. I'm sorry. What is this? Facebook. I think you're going to get paused here. I do have to pay a bill. I will be right back. The rest of you guys are just going to watch me pay the bill, I guess. Okay. Yeah, they haven't billed me yet. All right. All right. Anything else from you guys on that? Offshore trust, generational wealth trust. No, well, I guess it's not exactly true. We typically don't do too many testamentary trusts unless it's on a relocation client, right? Because again, if you're not here, that trust should be developed by a local professional who understands like the state laws and all of that stuff, not just, and in certain circumstances, the county laws. Like we've encountered counties where like for things like real estate, they actually have special rules, right? So then that your trust has to be designed to meet those special rules and what it takes to like move a title deed to a beneficiary or move a title deed into a trust, right? One of those places that sticks out was Prince George's County. They have special rules on how to move a title deed into an organization. It's not just a quick claim deed like it might be, elsewhere, or a warranty deed, like we could use in like Pennsylvania. So Different places have different local rules that definitely our international attorneys wouldn't be aware of, but even like an attorney in your state might not be aware of. So we do see mistakes that people make that they think they're being clever, where they'll go to like the capital, right? So like they'll kind of live in the boonies and they'll go to like the big city where the big, smart lawyers are and get one of them, right? And that lawyer might not know what's going on in their county, right? And actually jam them up. We've seen that happen multiple times, where folks are like we do a lot of work in Pennsylvania because I'm from Pennsylvania, so somehow the algorithm knows that and pushes a lot of a lot of what I do to Pennsylvania. So we'll do a lot of work in Pennsylvania where people be like, "Oh, I'm going to go get a Philly lawyer." Well, all right, well, you don't live in Philly. You live in Allegheny County. And Allegheny County is a county of the second class, which means it has special powers as far as passing laws, right? And so you need a lawyer from Allegheny County. And so don't think that like, oh, okay, I, you know, I live out in the boonies. I'm going to go to the big city and get the big fancy lawyer, so that I get this done right. Get your local lawyer. Like, get the lawyer that's, you know, in the county and the state, wherever you're looking to implement this thing, and go from there. People forget that a lot. People will like take care of the IRS and forget that like their state probably has a tax service as well. And your state's going to make the argument that even though you left the country, you're still a tax resident of the state, right? Unless you plan for that in advance and can, prove that you're no longer a tax resident there, which is typically a preponderance of the evidence, which means that there's no one thing that's going to prove that. There's typically, you have to show kind of like a an actual case of, I left this time, I don't intend to come back. How do you know I don't intend to come back? I didn't renew my driver's license. I have a driver's license in the new country. I didn't renew my voter registration. I have a voter registration in the new country if I have the right to vote in the new country. I don't have an address there anymore. I have an address in the new country. Like, all of those tiny little pieces become part of the body of evidence to prove that you're no longer a state tax resident, right? Because the Fed is typically easier about it than the state, because as the Fed, you have to file a tax return anywhere in the world if you're an American, so they don't really care. But it's the state that can see the federal return and they're like, ooh, we could have got 10 grand in state taxes off of this. Where's our piece, right? So that's where those are the ones that'll try to challenge you sometimes on whether or not you ever stopped being a state tax resident, right? So, a lot of people don't even think about that because they don't have professionals on their team, and they just think, well, I left. I don't live there anymore. Why would I be paying taxes there, right? And the state will jam you up. The state will come for you, and you'll have to prove that you're not a tax resident there anymore, which could be an easy thing to do if you have professionals. Right, but you don't know what you don't know. That's the whole point of just getting professionals on your team. No, I don't have to be your professional, especially if you're not coming to Kenya. I shouldn't be your professional. You just need to have a professional. We're specialists in Kenyan relocation. We're specialists in offshore trust funds, specifically generational wealth trusts, that utilize the special abilities of Kenyan generational wealth trusts to benefit you. But if you're not coming here, I don't need to be your professional. You just need to have one. Even some of the people who do come here, we refer them out to other people. Depends on what their goals are. They may have goals that are incompatible with what we do. So we're not just going to take their money, you know what I mean, and them not get the best service. So even people who are coming here, sometimes we refer them out to other people. Ask your viewers to like and share the live. Apparently, TikTok says you guys should like and share the live. That doesn't apply to Facebook and YouTube. All right, why hasn't this bill come yet? Give me 1 second to get this bill. Hey, can you send me the amount to pay you? 580. All right, I'll send it now. Thank you. All right. And just like that, they're paid. M-Pesa is really, really good. When you come to Kenya, you'll be able to utilize M-Pesa. Your trust fund will also have an M-Pesa, actually. You can just shoot money back and forth through M-Pesa. It's a digital currency platform. It's really, really good. It was invented by Kenya. And that's it. Paid. All right. Sorry about that, Facebook, but we are back. All right. Any other questions? Any other questions? I think we're good then. We have been at it for 2 hours, 7 minutes, and 40 seconds. And if there are no other questions, then I think we'll wrap it up. Looks like we're good. If you are typing a question, just go ahead and press enter, and then I'll give you the time to finish what you're trying to say. If you're about to ask a question, you can throw a one in the chat, and I'll wait for you. But it looks like there's no more questions, so it looks like we're all right. Tomorrow is going to be a case study because it's going to be after the call. We're going to do our end of year call to generational wealth clients who laddered. So tomorrow there should be like documentation that, you know, how for you Facebook guys, you might want to join us on TikTok tomorrow, where I'm going to put up those actual pictures of those documents so you guys can follow along. I do put it also up on YouTube as a green screen, but it's difficult to read. The way that YouTube sizes the image sucks, unfortunately. But the way that TikTok does it, you could read the entire image. So tomorrow, you guys who are Facebook might definitely want to come over to the TikTok side. If not, you just follow along by voice. YouTubers might make sense for you guys to do the same thing, but you will be able to see some of it. It's just a really weird structuring when you put up the green screen on YouTube. And then like I'm in the way, like I'm in front of it. On the TikTok one, I'm behind it. So me like moving around doesn't block you reading anything. But we will go through the compounding that happened with those trust funds, or the aggregate of the trust funds. We're not going to go over, 350 different trust funds and go through every single one. But we'll pick one and we'll show all the numbers We will not reveal whose trust fund it is, um, but we'll show all the numbers and go through that. So you won't get the benefit of the entire call because you're not onboarded clients. Unless you are, then you know that call is coming up tonight. But you will get to see a page or two just so you get a feel for what that looks like. And I did not get one in the chat, and I did not get any half-written posts, so it doesn't look like I'm waiting on anything. So thanks for being here. As always, I will be here tomorrow around the exact same time. And like I said, tomorrow we will be reviewing some of the information that we get from the annual call from tonight. So you'll get to see what kind of money a trust that is using the bonds has made over the past year. All right, guys, talk to you later. Bye.